In today's episode of Today in World War II, May 2nd, Mussolini offers the U.S. a deal it can refuse. The RAF's best ace, in my opinion, shoots down another victim. The Germans announced that they're going to starve millions of Eastern Europeans. A U.S. or a British cruiser is swarmed upon by German destroyers in the Arctic and sunk. The Japanese attack Australia. An American destroyer wants more than a cracker. General Field Marshal Alexander accepts the surrender over 1 million men. The Dutch Queen returns to Holland, and finally, the Berlin garrison surrenders. Let's get started. All right, so on today's May 2nd, 1940, Mussolini. Notice that we're in 1940, so he's still alive and kicking, unfortunately. He offered the United States a deal that it turns out it could refuse, right? I think Mussolini should have spent less time trying to put down the Italian mafia and learning lessons that when you offer a deal, you want to make sure it's a deal they can't refuse. So, in other words, FDR did not have wake up and have a horse's decapitated head in his bed. He offered that Italy would not go to war with the United States if the U.S. would stay out of Europe. Well, this was an interesting point of view, and it would have been all well and good if in 1941 his Axis partner and I don't know, big buddy Adolf Hitler hadn't unilaterally declared war on the United States after Pearl Harbor when he very easily could not have. So by doing that, whatever Mussolini had said previously, of course, was null and void. And the last thing Italy wanted to do was have the full weight of the American armed forces coming against him. In addition, I mean, look, he wasn't able to stand up against the Brits. How is he gonna do this? You know, how is he gonna survive against the Brits and the Americans, even though they were inexperienced? Again, logistics. You think Italy, with their few little factories in northern Italy, would be able to, um, cope with the weight of men and machinery coming towards them? I don't think it will turn out very well. On May 2nd, 1940, my favorite RAF ace of the war, Roland Robert Stanford Tuck, shot down his second victim in an ME-110. What's interesting about this is that his squadron leader was shot down that same day, and Tuck became the commander of the 92nd Spitfire Squadron. Little interesting inside baseball here. A lot of people don't know this, but Tuck's commander or squadron leader was Robert Bushell, South African pilot. He was obviously, you see, he was shot down very early in the war. This was only their second mission as a squadron, and he went into captivity. Why is that of any note? Well, Bushell becomes Big X in The Great Escape. What's also interesting about this is that in January of 1942, Tuck is going to be shot down by anti-aircraft in France when he was on a rhubarb mission, and eventually he winds up at Stalag Luft 3, reunites with Roger Bushell, and is his roommate, and they become well, they were already obviously friends, but they became close friends, and it's only by a stroke of luck. And Tuck was known for his luck. In fact, it was called Tuck's Luck that he was transferred out of Stalag Luft 3 right before the escape happened. He would have gone out with Roger and he would have been shot. Like when the Gestapo shot their 50 the 50 RAF officers who participated in the escape. So just a little bit interesting history there, right? On May 2nd, 1941, a German memorandum noted that the plan to remove large quantities of food out of Eastern Europe to feed German civilians and their military personnel would likely result in starvation of millions of Eastern Europeans, especially through the winter. The plan would continue to be implemented. However, now let's just put away any kind of BS about some memorandum. All right, this was a plan. This was the way. This was the final solution for the Slavs. They were going to be starved. Okay, there was only going to be a small population left to be slaves. And as I mentioned in a previous video, go back and look at it. There was, in Poland, for example, there were very strict rules on what the Polish slaves could do, and one of them was not have sex. Okay, so they didn't want to reproduce, which didn't make sense to me at the time because you want to keep your work supply going. But my point is that the final solution for the Jews and the gypsies and the homosexuals and the mentally and challenged, anyone who wasn't Aryan and could be a cog in the Nazi machine, their fate was in the gas chambers. Now, as we saw in when the war starts in the Soviet Union, and what do the Germans do? What was their modus operandi for killing most of the Red Army soldiers that fell into captivity? It was starvation. And so that was what they were going to do with the Slavs. Gas chambers for the list of people groups of classifications of people that I just listed, starvation for the Slavs. Don't think that wasn't it. It was. It was a final solution for anyone not German. But remember, all these people I listed, including Slavic people, they were all Untermenschen. They were all subhuman and deserving of either slavery at best, liquidation at worst. On May 2nd, 1942, the damaged British cruiser Edinburgh was off of Bear Island, and it was swarmed by three German destroyers. It's very interesting, this event here. It didn't happen very often where you had German destroyers on the offensive. Usually they stayed close to home with their capital ships, who they went out on surface raids, but by this time it was getting more and more rare. Well, the Edinburgh, unfortunately, was damaged. It was escorting a convoy to the Soviet Union, and off of Bear Island, it was attacked by three of these German destroyers. It was sunk, but it did manage to damage one of the destroyers so much that it had to be scuttled because there was no way it was going to be able to be towed back to Norway. So at least it got one of its attackers before it went down. On May 2nd, 1943, the Japanese attacked Darwin with about 20 bombers, 0 fighters, and of course, the RAF, this would be the RAAF, the Kangaroo Air Force, did intercept them, but they suffered heavy losses because, even at this time, sure they had P-40s, and the P-40, if you tried to dogfight with a zero, you were going to get shot down. There were specific dive and zoom tactics that worked, just like the P-47 Thunderbolt. They tried to dogfight with the ME-109 or the Focke-Wulf 190. You probably didn't get shot down, but if you use the right tactics, it was still effective. It looks like that they did not follow those tactics here because a lot of them were shot down. And the Northern Australia did get hit, more than a few times. And so, but the rest of Australia, obviously, because it was too far away from the Japanese never got there. However, if they would have taken Guadalcanal or resisted in Guadalcanal, and they could have started interdicting supplies from the United States to Australia, it could have been a different story. On May 2nd, 1944, the American destroyer, the USS Parrot, was severely damaged in a collision in Norfolk by a Liberty ship, and it was never repaired. And you might ask yourself, well, why is this? Why do you care about this? Why am I bringing this up in one of my blurbs about May 2nd? Because I can make a parrot joke. So apparently, the USS Parrot did not want a cracker. It wanted that John Morton to not collide with it. Wah, wah. That's a bad joke. I apologize for that. On better news, on March 2nd, 1945, British Field Marshal Harold Alexander officially accepted the surrender of all of the Axis forces in Southern Europe. So over 1 million men under arms in Austria and Italy surrendered, and that ended that theater rather ignominiously. I will say this, that for 2 years, the Germans kept them from breaking through into Southern Europe. Now, the Germans were masters at defense, but that that Italian countryside was the best foe, or the most effective foe against the American and British Commonwealth and French, Polish troops that were. That was a terrible field or theater to fight in. I'll tell you that right now. Probably the only thing worse was the jungles in New Guinea. I think that would be worse. On May 2nd, 1945, the commander of the German garrison accepted Soviet General Strikov's terms of unconditional surrender, and the Berlin garrison, excuse me, went into captivity. I think it was appropriate that Trukov was the one that was the general that took the surrender from the Germans, because if you may or may not know this, he was commanding the Soviet forces inside Stalingrad. He was there, and that was, a lot of the defense of Stalingrad and the successful defense of Stalingrad was because of his leadership. And so I think it was appropriate. And then finally, on May 2nd, 1945, Queen Wilhelmina of Holland, she returned to the Netherlands. And at the same time, the Germans did not have any problem. They fled through American and Canadian and British trucks with supplies and food to be delivered to the Dutch population, who was starving. And the Americans, in addition to that, about 400 B-17s dropped K rations over Amsterdam onto Schiphol Airport. And as an American, even though it's what, 50 years later or so, maybe more than that, 70 years later, I want to apologize to the Dutch profusely for having to eat K rations. Ugh. Anyway, that's the synopsis of what happened today in World War II on May 2nd. I appreciate you being here. I will see you tomorrow.